Can confinement spark a resurrection of human values? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to an Easter Monday edition of the France 24 debate. Empty streets marking the first bank holiday here in France since the start of the lockdown nearly 4 weeks ago. And the streets, well, look the same as any other day this past month. How isolated are we? How connected are we in a time when usually churches are full, families are gathering around the table for a holiday meal? This year, the calendar has Easter and the Jewish feast of Passover at the same time on the calendar. How are Seders over social media? And even if you're not religious, you're probably still pondering where it all leaves the ties that bind us to a community and whether we can make the most of this unprecedented period to improve how we treat each other when we get out of it. Will we return to our old ways and take for granted those people who provide essential services in times of crisis? Will we do more to redress inequality and social injustice? Or will it be worse? Will we scapegoat? Will we blame others? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at how humanity can learn from this current crisis. And joining us, Anna Rollins, Associate Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University in England. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Also want to welcome from Marseille, Raphaël Lioget, Professor of Philosophy and Sociology at Sciences Po's annex in Aix-en-Provence and also at Columbia University. Welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Journalist Pamela Druckerman has not been standing idle during lockdown. The author of There Are No Grown-Ups has co-founded Pandemonium U. What's Pandemonium U?
It's a series of online classes for kids and grown-ups taught by housebound experts from around the world. You tune in via Zoom, and if you want to get on our mailing list, we have a Facebook page, Pandemonium U.
Pandemonium U is that address. Thanks for being with us, Pamela. And thank you, by the way, to all of you for joining our conversation on the hashtag F24debate. Anna Rollins, lockdown for you, well, has included, it seems, being ill.
Yes, well, only in a mild way. But yes, certainly I had the cough. I had most of the symptoms, and I spent about 7 or 8 days completely in isolation by myself. Yeah.
7 or 8 days in complete isolation. What was it like?
It was almost like being on a really bad religious retreat. So the first couple of days, obviously, I was feeling pretty ill. I understood I was by myself. By day 3, I think it was really getting to me. And I actually found it psychologically much harder than I thought I would. And then the rest of the week, once I'd kind of gone through that wall of really a mental battle with myself, was actually much better. And in some ways, I think I actually learned some quite important things about myself by going through that experience of confronting my own need to rely on some inner resources. So I found it surprisingly like being on a religious retreat I'd never chosen to go on, without a decent guide, but actually quite fruitful in a strange way.
All right, before I ask you what lessons you learned, just tell me, really, how isolated were you? Yes, you were all by yourself, but today, thanks to technology, you're in touch with everybody.
Yeah, so of course I had people who would drop shopping at the gate for me outside my house, and I had my mobile phone, and so if I wanted to text somebody or call them, I could. But I actually think that although we are deeply connected and therefore we're not completely alone, actually we are being forced through this illness and through the lockdown to go deep into some really difficult psychological places. And so actually we're thrown back on ourselves psychologically, even though we're still connected. So sure, we're connected, but actually don't underplay the extent to which this is actually quite a serious process of self-reflection, and really throws us back on inner resources.
So, Pamela Druckerman, have you been self-reflecting, or like me, have you been binge-watching Tiger?
There does seem to be a lot of pressure to have this big moment now where you learn about yourself, you connect with your family, you know what you truly value. But I think a lot of us are having, trying to just keep our houses clean of filth and keep our children from murdering each other. So it's and yet we do learn a lot, and it is a moment where it feels like there are big lessons to be extracted. And I personally, I don't want to miss them. I'm sort of trying all the time to figure out what they are. I feel like it's a moment where wisdom kind of comes to the forefront. We need our leaders more than ever to be wise, and it becomes increasingly evident, where there's wisdom and where there isn't, and who can see the big picture, who knows the limits of their own knowledge.
French or U.S. politics at this point?
I'm talking about all of them. I mean, you look at somebody like Angela Merkel and how she's handling this crisis versus somebody like Donald Trump, and you look at Macron, who's maybe perhaps somewhere in the middle. One huge element of wisdom is compassion. And you really see very powerfully now which leaders have compassion and which ones are sorely lacking in it.
Raphaël Lioget, you quoted Blaise Pascal, I saw on Twitter about this. Human beings, we just don't like to be alone with ourselves, do we?
Yeah, I think it's a very paradoxical experience that we are living. In a way, we are rediscovering intimacy, what is to be with yourself and with your very close family. And in another way, we have never been so connected in the same time. We are with everybody on a very large scale. I mean, the perfect image of that, the perfect metaphor of that will be because we were talking about religious experience, will be the what has actually experienced the Pope Francis alone on St. Peter place. I mean, it's really weird with nobody. That never happened. And in the same time, maybe there wasn't a time where there was so many people watching him. So in the same time, we are all together, and at the same time, we are on our own. And this paradoxical experience, I think, it's quite unique, really quite unique. It's coming back to an archaic time with ourselves, and at the same time being in like hyper modernity because we are connected in real time. That's really strange.
Yeah. Are we alone, or are we together more than ever, connected more than ever on this Easter Monday? Anna Rollins, there's a group from where you are in England called the Beatles. They had a song, Father Mackenzie writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear. And in that song, Eleanor Rigby, everybody's so busy all the time and nobody's in the church anymore. And it's very, the loneliness of modern society is brought forth. Are we feeling that loneliness, or are we coming closer together?
Well, I think there are people who are feeling that loneliness in quite a deep way. But I suspect that some of that is also about people who feel that they are utterly reliant on services that are now not there for them. So it's not simply a physical aloneness. I think there's both a psychological aloneness and a social aloneness that we need to be very, very conscious of. There are people living in extremely precarious situations. So on the one hand, I mean, a lot of my work is on refugees and refugee situations. On the one hand, there's people who are busy trying to keep their houses clean, as Pamela was talking about, and they're being driven demented by trying to make sure their kids' time's occupied, whilst also feeling like they should be rereading James Joyce simultaneously and baking sourdough. On the other hand, you've got people who are in extraordinarily precarious economic circumstances, and that precarity that we've lived with for the last 30 years or so is now clearly intensifying. And so that aloneness can be a sense of an absolute absence of support systems and mechanisms. So I'm kind of interested in the psychological aloneness, the spiritual aloneness, but also very conscious of that social aloneness, a kind of crisis of solidarity that we've been living with for really a very long time. And I think that side of it, in terms of inequality and social aloneness and lack of solidarity, that's going to intensify.
Raphaël Lioget, that social aloneness, that psychological aloneness, it's going to be one of the topics. We're recording this, by the way, before the French president will have spoken this Monday evening. One of the decisions he has to make is how to deconfine. And there's talk that for elderly people who are being kept away from their grandkids and being kept away from their loved ones, that they may be the last ones to come out of confinement. Again, that psychological loneliness, can technology overcome it?
Yes, yes. I mean, it's a time where some people. It's also a time where inequalities will be, in a way, more emphasized, because we'll have some people like the weakest one, the lonely ones, the poorest one, that'll feel that they are more lonely than they were before, more, I mean, helpless. And other people, we could say, like us, in a way, that it's more a time of what we could call the kairos. You know, in Greek, this word kairos, that means some kind of a window of opportunity to realize what is our life, what we can do, so we can use this loneliness positively. But it's not the case for everybody. And I think when we are going to get out of this confinement, and I think we might not, it will not be like just everybody will go out. It will be step by step, I think. I think we will be in a situation where even the weakest one will have to stay in confinement, because they are actually the weakest one, and other people will start to live normally. So I think this time is a time also where we can address in a more concrete way what means inequality in our society. I think, yes, I think it's a time of crisis. You know, these Greek word crisis that is used for disease usually. It's when you reach such a point that you can't come back in the disease, but in the same time, it's the time where you can still save yourself if you realize what is actually happening. And I think it's what is at stake now too. We have the time to see what is really our society, what are the really deep problems in our society that we didn't have really time to address, or we addressed it in a very blurred way, if I can say. And now we are just in front of it when I'm thinking about ecology, inequality, and all that. So are we going to come back to the ancient world, or are we going to change to make a real turn? I think that's the real question.
One man who says he's seen the future is the American writer and film producer Julio Vincent Gambuto. He published a piece on Medium called "Prepare for the Ultimate Gaslighting." And in that piece, Pamela Druckerman, I'm going to quote from it. He says, "The treadmill you've been on for decades just stopped. Bam. And that feeling you have right now is the same one as if you've been thrown off your Peloton bike and onto the ground. What in the holy F just happened? I hope you might consider this. What happened is inexplicably incredible. It's the greatest gift ever unwrapped. Not the deaths, not the virus,
right,
but the great pause. It is, in a word, profound. Please don't recoil from the bright light beaming through the window." Pamela, do you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, profoundly. I think there's a kind of relief, in a way, that we all have a moment to sit and reflect and reset. I mean, we were living in a moment of such terror, of environmental catastrophe, of political tension between these big cleavages in societies. And there was a yearning for, like, can we just stop and all be reasonable and think about what we want to do? And I think because there are such huge proposals on the table, like in America, how to reform healthcare, how to deal with planetary issues, environmental issues, I think it's a wonderful space that we've created for ourselves, even though there are terrible elements of it, to think about how do we create, as the other guests have said, a more just society. Do we really, how do we create, jobs that create dignity and a decent quality of life for people?
Anna Rollins, you talked about this being an opportunity for a resurrection of humanity.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I was speaking this morning on a question of how Easter as a Christian festival might relate to current events and to coronavirus. And one of the things that really struck me is the tradition in early Christianity of thinking about Easter not as a day off or a rest day, but rather as the beginning of a new social task, as the 8th day of creation, the first day of the week. And very much the Easter spirit of the early church community inspired a whole series of social innovations, of forms of hospice care, care for migrants, a whole series of forms of social creativity. And I think my sense is that resurrection is found at the moment both in the tiniest detailed task of keeping coronavirus patients alive. And I've been really moved by doctors' descriptions of their own sense of powerlessness and vulnerability in the context of a disease that they simply don't understand, and how to find ways to save lives. But equally, so that's the fine, detailed, moment by moment, person by person version of what resurrection looks like right now. But then there's this massive social task of what comes next, of reimagining, as Pamela's just been saying, as Raphael's been saying, a more just future. And that requires a total rethinking of our model of living a communal life. And I think that's actually one of the things that inspired early Christian communities, was actually rethinking work, social care, how to be a community together. And ultimately, I think that's actually a narrative task. It's about the kind of fundamental story we're willing to tell ourselves and the stories we're willing to buy about what it means to be human together.
In that article, though, I quoted from, there's the fear that we're going to go on this mass bender of consumerism when it's all over.
Yeah, and for sure, I think there will be some people who respond to it by doing that. But I also think for a lot of people that learning to live more simply, learning to live a slower pace of life, and I say that myself as somebody who travelled endlessly for my academic work, and I've had real pause for thought to think, actually, I didn't need to travel in the way that I was, and I convinced myself I did. And I found that the stilling and the slowing of my own pace of work life has actually been intellectually productive. So I think that there are some people who certainly will decide that a mass consumerist bender is where they go. But I think there'll be an awful lot of people who, and I have talked to many people in this situation already, who have admitted that they are benefiting massively from that change of quality of life, and they want to maintain elements of that. So I think there's a chance for us to learn about different ways of living together.
And will religion be different?
Yes, well, I think religion might be, although I have to say one of the things that's given me some pause for thought and a bit of a smile is how quickly religious communities have wanted to fill the void. It seems that religious people are just as uncomfortable with the silence and the stillness as everybody else is. And I suspect we should be leading more by example in that context. But I think certainly there will be a sense of how a long religious tradition that includes social care as well as piety and liturgy can be part of that task of reconstruction and rebuilding. And I think religious communities have been part of that act of major social reconstruction at every point, both in terms of kind of pastoral care and social structures, but also in terms of the kind of narratives and social imagination that are needed to restructure our politics. And Pamela's spoken already about that critical question of leadership. And I think that religious communities need to speak into that space too, not just be, as Pope Francis would say, the ambulance service or another NGO. We have a massive task of complete social reimagining in front of us.
Yeah, I want to get back to that issue of political leadership, which is important. But Pamela, let me ask you, because last Wednesday was the beginning of Passover, and you hosted a socially distant Seder, the Passover dinner. What was it like?
It was chaotic. I should say that I wasn't planning to host it, but it became quickly clear that there was a leadership vacuum, so I stepped in unprepared. And it was lovely. It just was a way, it was in 3 or 4 different countries, and it was a way for different friends, some Jews and non-Jews, to sort of check in with each other and tell this ancient story together, which always feels healing in a way. The reports from my kids were that it was just as boring as a real life Seder. So it was a success.
I was going to ask, because the youngest boy in a Seder is supposed to ask the 4 essential questions. Who asked the questions?
There was a little bit of competition. I had to mute a kid in Berlin who was trying to take over. I'm not sure she was technically the youngest.
And following up on what Anna Rollins just said, did you think differently about what that ceremony means?
Yeah, I mean, there is a part in the Seder where you're supposed to wash your hands, and we all decided to skip that. We had our hands were chafed enough. But yeah, I think there is a, through religious people and in the secular realm, this real craving for connection and gathering. And Paris, where I live, is a famously kind of socially distant place in normal times. And last night I went out at 8 o'clock in front of my building, and there were people standing on their balconies on this big boulevard all around, just looking at each other and feeling each other's presence and realizing, for all the sort of, mysteries and distancing of normal life, we're all just like people living in our houses, all just cooking spaghetti on our stoves. And this feeling that there's more alike about us than is different was really soothing. And I think transforming in a way to a place where you just normally don't get that. Even just to see people walk, in France, you don't know if people are married, if they have children. They don't tell you anything about their personal lives. And now you see people walking down the street in their sort of small tribes. You see who they're with and what their lives are like. There's a simplicity to it. And also the volunteering, which you've seen all over the world, has been, especially in England, I've read a lot about that, this kind of of course there have been negative impulses too, but this craving to connect with other people, to help, to be part of the solution as a solution to loneliness as well.
Raphaël Liogé, here we sit in France, which is famous for this dichotomy between organized religion and the Republican state, the French notion of secularism. That's a topic for a whole nother debate. But the French feel uncomfortable when they talk about spiritual matters. Has that changed since the beginning of confinement?
It's a complex matter, but I will say that it's not because we pretend we're not religious that we don't have religious reactions in front of what is actually happening. And it's what we are doing now. Like everybody's thinking that he has the right solution, that he knows what is actually happening, and he has some hypothesis, and some people become their own prophet and trying to forecast what is going to happen. But if you don't mind, I'd like to address just something that is, I think, very important, is what is the main lesson that we can feel, even if we don't express it, and some people express it from these crises, from these virus crises. I think the main lesson is the awareness of the frailness, the fragility, the weakness of our very institution, of our very modern institution. We thought they were very strong, and they are based on two main things. One is science and technology, and the other is our economic system, like capitalism as a whole. And in both fronts, we can see that we have seen that they all, in a way, collapsed so easily from one day to another, and in front of what? Of something so small that we call the virus, not even visible. We don't even know, unlike a bacteria, if a virus is alive or not living. It's so small. It's not supposed to be. It's almost nothing. It's so simple, and in front of all the complexity of our science and technology, that can't do anything against it. And, when we think about capitalism on the other side, we think that the bigger it is, the stronger it is, the richer we are, the more powerful we are. And like this virus that is almost nothing is stronger than all our system. And we could even spend billions.
And you're saying, Raphaël, because it's true, scientists, entrepreneurs, they know how to answer questions that begin with how. How do you do this? How do we make that work? Whereas philosophers, religious people, you try to ask questions that begin with why. Why is this the way it is? Talk about the meaning of things. And you're arguing that, well, we don't know how to answer those questions that begin with why?
Yeah, even the how. Even the how was a problem, because even those techno entrepreneur now in that deal with new technologies that pretend that they will solve everything in the world. This idea in transhumanism, for instance, with the augmentation of the strength of man with technology, hybridization with machines and all that. And we see that the most archaic virus, the most archaic things is just challenging us, and we can't do anything. So I think it's from that we need to start if we want to rebuild something, if we want to have a new start, to be aware of this inner weakness, to become maybe stronger, but in another way. I think it's what is because I don't want to right away talk about these why question. It is a very religious, personal, individual, intimate question, but just how to fulfill our life, how to make strong institutions, but maybe in a different way, because strength is maybe not what we think. Look, the virus is so small, it's so nothing, and it's stronger right now than what we think we have built.
Anna Rollins, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, my own feeling is that indeed the virus does show up the weakness of modern institutions, but I think the stress signs on those institutions has been there for a long time, and we've chosen to live with a degree of denial about that. And actually, many of the frontline workers, the key workers who we are now depending on in hospitals, in public services, in service sector industry, those are the people who've been under chronic pressure, both in their workplaces and also because of their salary levels, etc., and the precarity of their work in their family and personal lives. So actually, if we listen to the wisdom of those who actually staff those institutions, we would have seen the stress signs in those institutions long ago. So the social regeneration of those core modern institutions is absolutely something that I think the virus shows up. I do think it's too early, and I will sound a little contrarian here, but I do think there are lessons to learn, but I don't think we yet know what all of those lessons are. I think we have to be listening and learning, and particularly listening and learning to those who are on the front line of this crisis in public health systems and other institutions. So there needs to be a degree of humility and patience and caution and deep accompaniment of the people who are not simply sitting at home, but actually who are there trying to lead this response.
Okay, Anna, let's go back then to the beginning of our conversation when you were describing when you fell ill at the beginning of the lockdown. You said you learned some things personally. What did you learn?
Well, I was in the semi-luxurious position in one sense of having nobody else here with me. So my son's 19 and he was with his father. So I was here by myself. I found the silence and the stillness really hard. I live a very busy academic life. I travel all over the world, and suddenly finding myself confined to my own home with nobody else with me, nobody else to depend on, and with huge amounts of silence and stillness. That really, for me, was massively confronting of the way I have structured my own modern existence. And I became very envious of people who did have children to run around after and be driven mad by, because actually just confronting that silence was really tough. And I had to learn to live with that quiet and that stillness. And it's changed the way that I'm now living my day-to-day life.
I know it's more cramped in the Druckerman household. What have you had time to learn in all of this?
For learning really is going to be the next step. I think about this period as like when you go abroad for the first time, which is really interesting. But the most interesting period is when you go home again and you see your home with fresh eyes, as an anthropologist would see it. You notice things you've never noticed before. And I feel like there's going to be a moment of that when we slowly come out of confinement and get to see the things we've always known in a new way and get to evaluate them. And I feel like just like when you come home from a vacation, the window for having your revelations is quite small, and we're going to need to really seize that moment to make changes that we want to make while it's all still fresh.
At the outset, Pamela, you were saying how this is a test of leadership and that we need leadership in these times. Over the weekend, we heard from a man who doesn't often give speeches. It's the president of Germany. It's largely a ceremonial post. Usually it's the chancellor that we hear. Frank-Walter Steinmeier had this to say.
Nein, diese Pandemie ist kein Krieg. Nationen stehen nicht gegen Nationen, Soldaten nicht gegen Soldaten, sondern sie ist eine Prüfung unserer Menschlichkeit. Sie ruft das Schlechteste und das Beste in den Menschen hervor. Zeigen wir einander doch das Beste in uns. Und zeigen wir es bitte auch in Europa. Deutschland kann nicht stark und gesund aus der Krise kommen, wenn unsere Nachbarn nicht auch stark und gesund werden.
Raphael Yegé, that's in stark contrast to what Emmanuel Macron said. He did describe this as a war. Your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought is that actually the president of Germany is is right, is much, I mean, why he's wiser than President Macron, because one of the main political lessons of this situation is the very fact that we are all in the same boat, and that it's not a war, but it's an exercise in solidarity. And it's something that, for instance, President Trump hasn't understood, because he tried to solve the problem in isolating the United States, and now the United States is a country that is touched even more than other country in the world. So we know it's not the right strategy. And I think the president of Germany wants even his country that is actually doing quite well, I mean, compared to other countries around, to not isolate itself because it's doing quite well. So I think it's a very interesting speech. Yes.
Yeah, a test, Anna Rollins, not of Germany, but a test of humanity. Yet we can worry that once it's all over, there will be scapegoating. I mean, we've already heard it. Some calling this a Chinese virus and that sort of thing, and it could be bad when it's all over.
Yes, but I don't think there's anything inevitable about scapegoating. Scapegoating is something which is socially created. And I think what's really interesting is to see the difference in political leadership and how that sets a tone. So the language in Germany, this is both Merkel's language and the language we've just heard, has absolutely been a language about solidarity, about people belonging together, about fundamental human vulnerability and interdependence. And it's time to rise to that challenge. Where you see a different kind of political tone, either a language of war or the kind of ethnic language, kind of white supremacist language that's been used elsewhere. This is a language of friend and enemy. It's a language that distinguishes and divides, that sets competitive markers. And to emerge into the world that we need to come into after this virus, the worst thing we can possibly do is begin with a fundamentally socially divisive and competitive language of friend and enemy. Nothing good ever came out of that politics, but it's not inevitable.
There's going to be a lot of economic hardship, Pamela Druckerman, and it'll be very easy, or very tempting, shall we say, for political leaders to blame that economic hardship on others.
Yes, I think we're already seeing authoritarian leaders around the world, from Hungary to Brazil to Turkey, kind of using the virus as an excuse to deepen their power, to seize more power, to weaken democracies. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges in places like America, where democracy is being very much challenged right now, is to make sure that the virus is an excuse to make us all see our shared humanity, and not, as the other speakers have said, to deepen divisions that are already there. So it's by no, this is an opportunity, but it's by no means a sure thing that it's going to be used for good necessarily.
Is there, Pamela, something that, we've all talked about playing musical instruments, baking bread, but is there something perhaps else that we can be doing during this period of confinement to prepare for afterwards?
Other than attend classes on the history of the Vichy government at our online school, I think my children are learning Spanish. There seems to be a lot of yoga going on. I think we're going to all emerge very fit from this confinement, paradoxically. But I think reading books is a fantastic exercise. As other people have said, just taking the time to examine your own beliefs, to not just live in the world of Twitter where you respond to things, but where you actually interrogate your own reactions and try to imagine what you want the world to be like. I think it's a beautiful moment for that and an opportunity.
Raphaël Yoget, everyone's been talking about Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, since the beginning of this outbreak. But really, should the book that we're reading be Anne Frank's diary? Is it about more confinement, or is it about the plague? Is it about the disease?
I think it's more. It's more about anxiety, and how anxiety diffuse, and how people react to a situation where death seems to knock at their doors, and they weren't used to, especially in a society that has actually, I will say, seems to be control death, control disease, control our destiny. And now we are just left with this uncertainty. I think the virus is also the image, the metaphor of uncertainty that we thought we had control. But I think one of the other awareness that we will have, it's not only even economically, when we're talking about negative sides, we think economically it's all negative. I'm not sure about that. For instance, I'm not sure that we are not going to become aware that we can work in a different way. Just the fact that more and more people became aware that they can work from their home now, and they can have a positive use of technology. And so this has to be underlined too, For instance, in the university, I saw that we gave class with video conference. We try to use multiple ways. And I think we are not, doesn't mean that we are going to carry on, to go on this way, but it will change something in the way we see how to work, in the way we see what is financial values, for instance. We think all the markets are going to go down. And maybe we will see that when the financial markets go down, maybe it doesn't change that much on another way economically too. So because the production can work without so much human effort, or a different kind of human effort, so we can share the wealth in a different ways, etc., etc., etc. So I think even economically, that could become positive. That could be used all negative, like if it become instrumental to concentrate more power. But that could become also another way to even improve democracy, improve solidarity, and also change in a very positive way.
Anna Rollins, are you that optimistic that
I'm not saying
humanity will change perhaps its values, and that will value less money and perhaps a little bit more the other things that are meaningful in our lives?
Well, you talked about paradox at the beginning, and I think that paradox is exactly right, because on the one hand, I think part of what we're being confronted with in a really uncomfortable way is limit and fragility. And we have told ourselves myths of mastery and control, of autonomy and so forth. And I think that confrontation with an ethical sense of limit does change us, and it changes us both in terms of it can make us very anxious, but actually there's a real ethical challenge there, and there can be very good things that come out of that confrontation with limit. On the other hand, I think what we're also seeing is real bravery and innovation, and I think that Raphael is right that there is innovation in the world of work. There are many people who will not want to go back to the office in a conventional way, unless, however, you're maybe in your early 20s, don't have brilliant housing, because certainly in the UK we've managed to wreck our housing market, and so actually you're working from your bedroom with flatmates who are people that you don't want to spend all your time with, and suddenly your work world and home world has shrunken down to one very stressful bedroom environment for working. So we need to not glamorize some of those changes around home working, but at the same time, I think deep innovation will come from this in work terms. And the medical reality is also that what we're seeing at that medical interface, and also alongside technology and engineering, is an absolute determination to innovate in the face of this virus and this disease. So on the one hand, limit and fragility, and a necessary ethical confrontation with that, and on the other side, bravery and innovation. And I'm just as interested in both of those as ethical possibilities.
All right, we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, so much more to say. I want to thank you so much, Anna Rollins, for being with us from Durham, Raphael Ligier for being with us from Marseille, Pamela Druckerman in the French capital. There's more, by the way, on our website, france24.com. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and on Facebook. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.